What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish the Moment. Today we're on Lake Hamilton, Central Arkansas, and we're gonna be doing another series where I do a practice day and then a quote-unquote tournament day out here. And this lake is my arch nemesis in the winter time. You've seen me do a few videos out here before, so hopefully I'll be able to figure them out in this practice day today and then crush them in the tournament day tomorrow. So let's get into it. Okay, so just like in my last practice day on 10 Killer Lake, I plan on dividing up this practice day into 50% driving and 50% fishing. And so I'm going to use the 50% of my driving time to basically graph offshore, and then the 50% of my fishing time to check shallower water. And I have fished quite a few times in December, the same time of year on Lake Hamilton. And if you've seen some videos in the past, you'll know that me and Hamilton don't have that great of a relationship. We kind of struggle to get along. And so in my past videos, I've done okay catching fish up shallow on crankbaits and jigs, things like that, but I really only catch anywhere from about 12 to 13 pounds of bass, which usually on Hamilton is not that great. Normally you need an 18 to 20 pound bag of fish to win tournaments. And so for this practice day, I really wanted to devote a lot of my time to trying to fish offshore, because I haven't really fished offshore in Hamilton that much, and I do know that there are good fish that are caught out there. And so I decided to take the first 4 hours of my day to graph around the lake and look for any available offshore structure and cover. So I basically started graphing on the lower end of Lake Hamilton and then worked my way up to the mid-lake section. And I was looking for two things while I was graphing: offshore rock and brush piles. These are two things I have a lot of success catching fish on in the wintertime offshore. And when I was out there, I didn't really know how deep the fish were going to be. So I started graphing as shallow as 5 feet and as deep as 35 feet of water. And the conditions were a little bit weird because the water temperatures were between 55 and 57 degrees, which is a little bit warm for the end of December. But what I found is that the majority of the fish I was finding were in that 15 to 25 foot zone. And when I was out there, I did find some really nice rocky areas, as you can see from my side imaging here. And all these rocky spots were kind of on a little ledge or a little drop. And I didn't really see any fish on top of the drops, but I did see a lot of fish off the drops in the shadows of these ledges. And so if we take a look at a couple of these images, you can see the shadows over here and then some dots in the shadow. Those are bass suspended over the drop. And so normally when I'm trying to catch fish offshore around a drop, I want to see these fish up on top of the ledge up here or on top of the drop, not suspended off the side like they are here. And so I wasn't that concerned about fishing for these fish, but it was at least good to know that there were fish in the area and that I found 4 or 5 rocky spots that seemed to have some fish around them. And then I also found a lot of brush piles in Lake Hamilton. And I actually didn't find any brush piles that looked like they had bass in them. They pretty much all look like crappie brush piles. And if I wanted to catch crappie, I would have crushed them on this day because I found a lot of crappie. And the way that I can tell that these brush piles have crappie in them or have bass in them is the way that the fish are positioned on the brush pile. If we take a look at this brush pile here, you can see that there's a ton of dots around this brush pile, but all these dots are stacked very tall, like 7, 8, or 9 dots tall, and they're only a few dots wide. This is normally crappie. And then bass are usually going to be the opposite. They're going to only be stacked 2 or 3 dots tall, but they're going to be spread more horizontally, just like this brush pile here. And so I saw a lot of the brush piles with crappie in them, but really didn't find any with bass. And so I wasn't that optimistic about the brush pile bite offshore, but I was pretty optimistic about these rocky areas I found. I had 4 or 5 good looking areas, and I know that if I pull up on these spots at the right time, I might be able to get some fish in the boat. And so after checking offshore for about 3.5 hours, I graphed a long time, but after graphing for 3.5 hours straight, I decided that I'd found enough offshore to at least give me a starting point, and now I wanted to start checking some of the shallow water and see if I could find maybe like a backup pattern up shallow if those offshore fish didn't work. So to make my decision on where to fish up shallow, I really wanted to take advantage of the recent rainfall we had in central Arkansas. And usually when you get some rain in the wintertime, it's going to cause an influx of water in the backs of the creeks and the backs of the pockets. And this will bring fresh water into the lake, which will bring plankton and other insects, things like that, into the water, and those shad will push back to where that water's flowing to feed on the plankton, and then the bass will follow the shad back in there as well. And so usually when it rains in the wintertime, especially when water temperatures are above 50 degrees, it's great to run into the backs of these pockets and find places where that water is moving. And so that's what I did. I actually ran to the very back of Little Mazarin Creek. And if you take a look at this Google Earth image, you can see that the main lake over here is pretty clear, 4 or 5 foot of visibility. And the back of this creek only had like 1.5 to 2 foot of visibility, maybe even less. And right when I got back in there, I pulled up on a rocky point and got 2 bites right away on a Spro RkCrawler. And I lost both those fish, but I did notice that there was really strong current running around these rocks, and that got me really excited because I felt like I would be able to maybe catch some fish in the back of this creek. And another thing I saw in the back of this creek was a ton of bait fish. Actually, right when I shut down my engine, there was a big ball bait fish right underneath my boat. And the area was just super active. I saw schools of fish around on my electronics. I was seeing shad kicking on the surface, on the Fishfinder, everywhere. And usually when you get into an area like this where you see a lot of activity on your graph, it's going to be a productive area. And this is something I look for not only up shallow but also offshore. Usually if you can find an area of the lake, let's say a 200 to a mile stretch of water where you see a lot of bait fish on your graph, usually there's going to be some bass in the general area. And as I was fishing through this creek, I actually got several bites. I got 4 bites in about 15 minutes of fishing, which is awesome. And usually this, again, is a good indicator that there's a concentration of fish here. Now, I didn't really catch anything back in here because the fish just kind of slapped at my crankbait or they were just kind of nipping at the jig. And so I didn't know if it was just the conditions, it was kind of bright, sunny, no wind, or what it was. But regardless, I knew there were fish in this area and I felt pretty confident that I could pull back in here and catch some if I picked apart all the different points of this creek. And so that made me really excited. And I actually knew several other places around the lake where water will flow into the lake when it rains. And so I didn't really want to worry about checking those areas just because I knew about them from past experience. So instead I decided to make a pretty big run up the lake to another creek that is kind of out of the way. It's quite a long run, so I didn't really want to run up there in the tournament unless I knew fish were there. And so I ran back in the back of the big Mazarin here and immediately, boom, caught 2 fish back to back, which is awesome. And again, right away I saw a bunch of bait fish on the graph. And as I was working my way through this creek, I saw that there were bait fish kicking on the surface. There were a lot of birds in the area, blue heron, cormorant, stuff like that. And there was also current flowing. And so I kept fishing back in there for a little while, caught a couple fish on an Alabama rig, and that was now 2 creeks in a row where there was current flowing in the back of the creeks, a little bit more stain to the water, and the fish were just biting. And so I was really excited about this because I felt like, if anything, I could pull back in the back of these creeks, catch a limit really quick, and then go focus offshore for the rest of the day. And I really only burned about 2.5 hours of my day checking these 2 creeks, not that much time at all. And so after rolling through these 2 creeks, I wanted to kind of establish maybe a third pattern or maybe check those offshore fish again. And one thing that was sticking in the back of my mind the entire time I was fishing in the back of these creeks was that current flow. And I wasn't sure if that current flow was there all day or if it just started in the afternoon when I pulled back in these creeks. And one thing I know about offshore fishing is that whenever the current flows on any lake, any reservoir, even a river system, those fish offshore are going to pull up in their active feeding positions, pull out of the creek channels on top of the ledges and get active. And so I decided to actually run back and check some of those rocky spots that I had graphed earlier to see if any of those fish had pulled up on top of the drop. And the first spot I pulled up to, I threw a 3/4 ounce football jig down there and boom, I hooked a good one. I mean, a really, really good one. And it actually pulled off halfway to the boat, but I'm thinking this was at least a 5 or 6 pound bass because it was fighting like a bass. It was actually coming up towards the surface. It didn't feel like a drum or a catfish or anything like that. And I know that there's some fish that were positioned on the spot earlier based on what I saw in my electronics. And so I was really pumped when I got this bite. And I felt like that current had maybe positioned those fish on top of the ledges. And so I didn't actually graph this spot before I fished it. Usually I do. So I decided to go check another one of the rocky spots really quick and just graph over the top of the ledge to see if some fish were there. And the first rocky spot I graphed over, oh man, they were all over the top of this thing. If you take a look at this image here, you can actually see all these dots on the top of this ledge, and there were just some fish spread out on top of the drop, and I'm thinking that current had pushed those fish on top of the ledge, and I literally didn't even make a cast here because I knew that if I cast down there I would catch one, and I just wanted to save them for tournament day. And so I was pretty much out of time at this point, but I felt really confident leaving this practice day because I had established 4 or 5 good rocky spots offshore, and I'd also found a really good shallow bite. And so I feel like my game plan, it was pretty easy and pretty straightforward. My plan is to start up shallow in the backs of the creeks, throw in a crankbait, maybe a jerkbait, Alabama rig, stuff like that, and just try to get 5 in the boat. Usually it's better when you're fishing offshore to get 5 in the boat quick if you can, just because the offshore fishing can be a little bit of a grind, especially if I have to wait on that current to start flowing. And then I would maybe take 2 or 3 hours in the morning to get my limit, wait for that current to start generating, and then pull offshore in the afternoon and hopefully drop the hammer on them and catch some really good fish offshore. And so I was really optimistic going into my tournament day, and I think that I'm going to crush them because the offshore fish just seem so productive. They seem like it could be the deal, and I finally figured out these fish on Lake Hamilton. So I'm super excited to get back out for that tournament day, go out there and try to put some of those big fish in the boat. And so that's pretty much it for this video. I felt like it was a really productive practice day, and I feel very confident going into the tournament day that I should be able to put some good fish in the boat. And so hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you learned something about how to practice for these tournament days, my thought process. I really tried to do a lot more voiceover in this video to really talk you through my thought process. And just let me know if you like that format, or if you like to see me fishing and talking while I'm fishing more. I want to do both, obviously, but I do want to try a lot of different things to see what is the most effective and what helps you guys learn the most. So please let me know in the comments what you think. And other than that, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.